Welcome to Networking RX, a podcast devoted to helping business professionals like you enhance your networking skills in order to become more proficient giving and receiving quality business referrals and improving the overall quality of your life and the lives of those around you. The Networking RX podcast is a production of AmSpirit Business Connections, an organization whose mission is to empower business success through networking.
Today, I want to talk about small talk. I can't remember when I realized just the whole notion of small talk. We've always made it. In high school, you would make small talk. Certainly talking to girls, being nervous. It's talking with your friends. Just small talk is just kind of that little bit of conversation that happens before you really kind of get into the subject matter. Why does everyone always talk about the weather? Well, it's something we all have in common, and it's kind of that icebreaker, if you will. Recently, I read an article by John Millen, and you can see a lot of John Millen's work at johnmillen.com. He's a corporate communication expert. He worked for Nationwide Insurance. He worked for the Hartford. He's worked for a lot of big service companies, being their chief communication officer. So he is really somebody who is rooted into just the wording of things, if you will. Somebody that I've known for a number of years, and I certainly encourage you to dig up his look into him and look at what he's got. He has got a weekly newsletter that comes out on Sunday mornings, and this is what I happen to stumble upon: 6 easy ways to make small talk. And I remember he tells a story. He starts off telling a story about working with a CEO of a company, and he calls him Steve, and they were going to go grab lunch. And so they were hopping on the elevator and riding down the elevator. And I remember, not Steve, but I remember these sorts of situations, being on the elevator as a young attorney, going down with the older attorneys, and it just being kind of awkward, and nobody wanted to say anything. Certainly as a newbie, I didn't want to say anything because, well, I'm a newbie. You don't talk to the boss. You don't make eye contact with the boss. And when you're working for a firm, it's not a boss, it's lots of bosses, and there's a hierarchy there, and you really don't know who anybody is, and it's just best to be quiet. It was always awkward, and that's what John talks about here is, it's being awkward. And he talked to his client who he was, providing coaching to on communications, and just asked this particular person, Steve, if you will, why he didn't say anything to anybody. Why was there that awkward silence? And I think Steve did say, hey, how's it going? Just something, and that was it, hello, and that was it, and didn't really take it any further. And essentially, Steve just said, it's awkward. Being a newbie, being an underling, it was terrifying. You didn't know what to say. And I can see somebody in that same situation being awkward. I don't know what to talk to these people about. I don't know where it's going to go. It's a 30-second elevator ride. I'm just going to take the elevator to the bottom floor. But when you're in business, you realize that that small talk is really important. And I've done episodes on this, other episodes, excuse me, talking about small talk and why small talk is important. And there are things. Our brain does this thing. It's called heuristic processing, and what it does is it creates a shortcut. It creates a shortcut to trusting people. And then if we're having small talk conversation with somebody, I'm going to grab a quick drink here. If we're having a small talk conversation with somebody, it kind of triggers this heuristic processing, and it sends a signal in our brain to say, you know what, you can trust this person. And I've talked about studies along these lines, and I won't get into the studies here. what I want to talk about today is kind of the nuts and bolts of small talk as John has presented them. And again, it's a great article. It's John Millen, Millen. And I've done other episodes with his work, talking about his work. But he has 6 easy ways to make small talk effectively. The first is being prepared. And I think that can certainly be, no, that is helpful. Not can be, it is helpful. He talks in here about going, if you know people are going to be somewhere, checking out their LinkedIn profiles, learning about their companies, finding things you can about people. And we live in the social media era, and it is so easy to find out who is who's doing what, who's connected to who, finding out that they're connected to somebody you know, they live in the same neighborhood. You can find out all these things. Now, that's certainly knowing, that's if you know that a particular person is going to be at a particular event. And that's always helpful. But a lot of times you don't necessarily know who are going to be at those particular events, and you still can be prepared. I go to networking events and I'm not necessarily prepared. I was on a what I call a get acquainted call this morning with somebody, and I was prepared. I was prepared to, now I knew who I was going to be on the call with, so I could prepare from that standpoint. But I was also prepared from the standpoint of, just knowing how I'm going to go in. And I don't generally get down to brass tacks. And if somebody comes at me and right away they're, getting right down to the heart of what the call is about, I just know it's not going to, I don't want to say it's not going to end well, but it's just not going to have it's not going to have as good of an outcome as if we kind of warm things up. And that's what happened this morning. We had a nice conversation, kind of warmed things up, really hit it off, and we're going to talk again. So you need to be prepared. And when you don't necessarily know who the people are, that kind of leads into John's second point, and that's start with a question. And when I tell people be prepared, I say, you need to be ready with questions. And I have certain go-to questions that I use. If you're seeing this on LinkedIn, the LinkedIn Live, or you're watching a recording of it, I put down in the comments a link to a document I created. It's a short document. It's called Converse, an aid for that first networking exchange. And in there, I share questions that are what I'll say near and dear to my heart. That when I'm out networking with people, these are things that are kind of right on the tip of my tongue that I am going to ask. And so you can go and you can click and you can download that. I had them printed up into little cards that are, just business card size, and I'll hand them out. I share them with all new members of AmSpirit Business Connections. But these are questions that I have found that I'm comfortable with in getting something, a conversation going. Um, I certainly ask what people do, and I don't do that as a means of trying to circle it back towards me. I just kind of want to understand about people. How long have you been doing it? How did you become interested in that? Those are things that can get people talking. Small talk, and this is probably an important piece to this whole thing. Small talk is not about what you have to say. It's really about what you're getting the other person to say. And that's the benefit, as John's indicated, with starting with a question. You get them talking. You're not trying to steer them towards your product or service. There's nothing about that's salesy in any form. You're just getting them talking, getting them comfortable, making their heuristic processing kick in gear so they trust you. So I'll certainly ask, you know, what they're about, what they're working on, projects, so on and so forth. I'll talk about, where they're from. And it doesn't always work out beautifully like that. So you might hear that somebody's, what do you do? This is what I do. How long you been doing that? Well, I just moved here to town. And so he, took this new position. It was newly created for me. Oh, that's great. Where are you from? So it can kind of jump all around. And so I just, there are not a ton of these, as you can see, if you look at the link. And I'll put the link in the show notes for those who are checking this out on as my regular podcast. Um, and I find that I can get a lot of information when people share where they're from. If they're from the local area, there's certainly a conversation about where did you go to high school, what part of town do you live in, or if they're not, what brought them to the area. What are things they do outside of work? I want to try and get into those things. What occupies you outside of work? How'd you become interested in that? How long you've been doing it? You're into skiing. Well, this is Ohio. There's very few places to ski in Ohio. If you're really an avid skier, where do you go? Um, and then I'll get into other organizations they're interested in, other business organizations, community organizations. And to be honest, I don't think I've ever asked all these questions. Usually one of these questions will kick off in a conversation about whatever. I'm a sports person, so if I hear somebody's from Wisconsin, I will probably have a conversation. I'll delve into the Packers. Are you a Packers fan? I talk to people over in the UK. I'll talk about what they call as football over there, FUTBOL, football, what we call soccer. Those are things I'm certainly interested in. Not that it always has to be about me, but I just kind of probe and see whatever, but see what they're interested in. But I'm asking questions. I'm prepared with things to talk about. The third thing John talks about is active listening, really listening to what people have to say. um, what is this? You ask the question, what's the answer? Know the answer, because if you listen to what people say, then it's going to delve into other questions, I find. Again, where are you from? Oh, you're in Wisconsin. Great. You follow the Packers, Yeah, we have season tickets, and if you have season tickets to the Packers, it's probably a 40-year-old deal, a 40-year-old ordeal as to how that happened. And so you can kind of get these stories, and then those kind of go down all these different rabbit holes. And it doesn't seem to make sense, and it doesn't have to make sense because you're building trust, but you need to listen actively to those sorts of things. And I've kind of implied this, but John's fourth point is you need to look for common ground. And that's generally what I'm doing. What's common ground? Oh, your kids play soccer. Well, my kids played soccer. Or your kids play volleyball. Well, my kids played soccer. What are the differences? What are the similarities? Whatever it might be. Again, sports is a big go-to for me. It doesn't have to be for everybody. I try to be interested in the things they're interested in, and if there's common ground, whatever it is, and I don't necessarily have to be into what they're into. If they're into hiking, I certainly know enough to talk to them about hiking. Do you camp? Do you have an RV? Are these day trips? So you can go off in all sorts of different things, but you're looking for common ground, common experiences. I went hiking years ago, and we did this, and it was my wife and I, we honeymooned here. We did this hike, and so you're just you're looking for common ground. John's fifth point is to keep it professional. And what he means by keeping it professional is that not that it has to go into business. Again, this is not a sales pitch. This is not, nothing about this is a sales pitch, but it is a business communication, if you will. And so what John encourages, and I totally agree with, avoid controversial topics, right? Nobody needs to talk gossip. Nobody needs to be getting into, religion or politics or those sorts of things. Now, obviously, if you're at the Republican National Convention, I think politics is probably part of the conversation, right? If it's something related to church, then religion certainly can come in. I'm not saying those things are totally off base, but if you don't know, then you're best to just kind of steer away from those particular topics. Especially if it's a first meeting with somebody. And as time goes on, as you become more comfortable with the person, it becomes more casual. Then you'll get a sense as to, okay, where can you touch on those sorts of conversations? It's going to depend. And then the last point that John makes, and this is really not necessarily related to the small talk itself, but it's tangential to it, and that's just the follow up. That's the follow up to the whole conversation, and letting people know that I remember that we talked. I remember that you're really into hiking, and oh, by the way, I just happened to stumble across this article that has to do with the health benefits of hiking. I didn't know if you saw it. Here's a link to it, right? You're sending a message to them that says, you know what, I enjoyed the conversation. I was listening to you. I care about you. And that just furthers developing the relationship with people. And that's the whole point to small talk. It's not to position them for you to get business or get introductions or get referrals. If you do it right, there'll be other conversations down the line where those things will come into play. But it's really about creating that relationship and getting people comfortable with you. So, number one, be prepared. Number two, start with a question. There's a link to my questions in the show notes or in the comments to this live feed. Active listening. Be sure you listen actively. Look for common ground, keep it professional, and then follow up on the conversation. 6 tips from John Millen. Get out there, have a small talk conversation with somebody. Make a point of it. You're on the elevator with somebody you don't know. You know what? If it fails miserably, there's really not a lot of risk. So you might as well give it a try.
Thanks for joining us on the Networking RX podcast. Please put what you've learned into action today and let us know if you have questions, comments, or ideas for future topics. You can email them to us at podcast@amspirit.com. That's AMSPIRIT.com. Finally, so you never miss an episode, be sure to subscribe to the Networking RX podcast through iTunes, Overcast, or however you receive your podcasts. Now get out and network with someone.
The Networking RX podcast is the copyright production of AmSpirit Business Connection. All rights reserved.